Next thing here we have, well, actually we're always concerned about something to do with mobile devices. What was the name of the malware? Was it the Black Shades? Is that right?
Black Shades Rat?
Yeah, Black Shades Rat. So this kind of feels like a little, maybe a little bit of a merging of the two. So Jim, what can you tell us about this new Android problem that was picked up?
This is from a blog post last week from a guy, I think his name is pronounced Simon Sedor. He's a computer science student. As part of a team project in a network security class, they were talking about using cameras on PCs and that kind of thing without turning the light on, so without making it visible to the user. You know, exactly the kind of thing that was happening with the Black Shades that we talked about last week. But this guy decided to take it a little further and see what could be done with mobile devices. And he took a look at the Android device, and since that's the easiest one to program for, and he had a Google Nexus device that he could play with. And what he discovered is that there are ways to make it almost impossible to detect that the camera is being used to take pictures or video. And it used a couple of standard techniques that ordinary Android apps are going to use. It was a little bit of a wake-up call, I think, for folks. These little devices can be used, you know, the cameras in them or potentially the microphones can be potentially used without the user being aware of it. There are some things that you can do to protect yourselves, and they're the same kinds of things we talk about all the time. One of the things is look at the permissions of the apps. He wasn't able to make it, you know, use the camera without first requesting the permission to use the camera. So, you know, look at the permissions. Do they need to have background services running? Obviously, keep your Google account secure. Turn on two-step authentication when possible. The big one that, and I know I have a tendency to not do it as much as I should, is if you're not using the apps anymore, uninstall them.
Right.
Get them out of there. Pay attention to battery consumption, bandwidth consumption, you know, all the standard things that we normally say to be on the lookout for. But this was it was not anything particularly new and groundbreaking. It was just using standard techniques that Android apps use, and you know, some novel things that folks have used in the PC world for a long time that I hadn't seen used in the Android world. But it turns out that it's not really that hard to do, unfortunately.
All right, so help me understand a little bit, or make sure I understand correctly. This is a case where once you have an app, you give it permission to run the camera, or you know, get access to the camera, and you give it permission to run as a background service, then effectively it can go and take pictures whenever it likes. Is that right?
Yep. Well, and in fact, it's not necessarily that you have to give any particular permission for it to run a background service. That's not a different permission. It's just the app, when it fires up this background service to keep it running so you can get notifications and that kind of thing. A lot of apps do that. But right. if the app has permission to use the camera, there are some supposed safeguards that folks thought were protecting them, like, you know, that it has to have something visible on the screen in order to use the camera. But it turns out that all that's necessary to be visible on the screen is a 1x1 pixel, which you can hide in anything. And with the resolution you can get on these screens now, most human beings are not going to notice 1 pixel in that entire display, even if you know where to look. Definitely got my attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, did you?
The 1x1 pixel trick reminds me of the early days of the web.
Right.
When you would have, you know, pixel bugs tracking on, you know, you go to a website and it would load all these tiny little 1x1 GIFs, and it would say back on the back end, okay, someone pulled down that file. They've obviously been to the site and they can use it for metrics.
Yeah, and it's I think this is one of these subtleties where it becomes a balance. You know, you'd like to be able to control the permissions in a more refined way, but ultimately, if you get I mean, I think it's a little bit overwhelming as it is. If you go through all your apps and are trying to figure out all the permissions for all those, you're effectively turning into a system administrator. It's really supposed to be a device that you can use every day and trust it. I think it really comes down to, in the end, is making sure that you're choosing apps from sources that you can trust. And that's kind of tricky in itself, but at least if you're using the mainstream stores, when people start filing complaints, you say, that there are things going on here, it's going to start getting better scrutiny. So I think that's really where you need to go with a lot of these cases, just to keep it practical.
Right. Yeah, and the mainstream, app stores have been doing a good job of, when it's brought to their attention, of pulling them, and they have the potential, the kill switch to kill them on devices where they're already installed if they prove to be malicious. So they've been good about that.
I was going to say that Google's done a pretty admirable job of getting those permissions into a granular level that people can still understand. But I think that since there's such an impetus to try and break that model, that people will try and push the boundaries of it. And it becomes not just, do you understand these categories, but do you understand the other between the lines implications of this permission plus this other permission over here. And that's when it starts to get a little too much for most users to handle, I think.
Absolutely. The other subtlety in this too is that, Jim, I think you had mentioned, if you're not using the app anymore, uninstall it. The other aspect of this is apps are not static. That is, you start out with an app and it gets updated, and so a lot of these applications, particularly if they're startup concepts, are going to have a lot of features added to them, and ultimately these are the kinds of things that can turn into, maybe there's no maliciousness involved, but it can still turn into a set of activities or capability that you never really intended in the first place. So I think it reinforces your point, Jim, about, if you're not using the app, get rid of it. And certainly if it changes in a way that you realize it's, not conducive or something that you desire. In fact, I would encourage providing feedback to the app creators, because ultimately that's how they're going to make their business better. That is by providing feedback, and if you don't like a feature, that might stick.
Yep, absolutely.
All right.